Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my review of the newest lens from Sony, the new 100mm F2.8 Macro GM OSS. Yes, we finally have a G Master macro lens, something that many of us have been asking for years. The question was, whenever that discussion came up, however, is how is a G Master going to distinguish itself from Sony's own excellent 90mm macro or excellent alternatives from Tamron or Sigma, Laowa, and the like? Well, the answer came by Sony leveraging what is one of the unique first-party advantages for their platform, namely that the G Master macro can utilize both the 1.4 times and 2 times teleconverters here on Sony. That opens up a world of new possibilities. While the lens has a higher than average 1.4 to 1 level of magnification, or 1.4 times macro magnification, you throw on the 1.4 times teleconverter, that focal length becomes 140 millimeters, and you get a 2 times level of magnification. Throw on the 2 times converter and you're up to 200 millimeters of focal length, and your magnification jumps up to 2.8 times. Obviously, that's a lot of additional versatility as to what you can do with this lens, the kind of working distance you can have, and of course you have outstanding autofocus with it all. This is a lens that is packed with features. It has all kinds of controls on the body itself. It has a thorough weather sealing. It has the unique clutch mechanism that allows you to have true manual focus. It does a lot of stuff really well, and on top of that, it's got amazing autofocus and the best optical performance that I've ever seen from a macro lens. Now, it is going to cost you. The MSRP is $1,500 US, and for a GM lens, that is not particularly expensive, but it is going to be more expensive than either the 90mm G macro and considerably more than either the Sigma or Tamron macro alternatives. So is this new G Master lens worth it? Well, we're going to dive in today and explore whether or not this truly is the gold master of macro lenses. So in full disclosure, this lens was sent to me by Sony USA for evaluation. However, it will be going back to them at the end of this review period, and they have had no input in my findings. This is a completely independent review. All right, so let's talk about the build and design of this new lens. This is the 23rd G Master lens, but the first of their macro lenses. And one of the things that I am impressed by is that while they have obviously dramatically expanded the capacity of this lens, it really isn't significantly heavier than what the existing 90mm macro is. In fact, at 646 grams, it is only 42 grams heavier than that lens, despite having a longer focal length, higher magnification, more space here. It's 17 millimeters longer to allow those teleconverters to fit inside, and it has additional features throughout. I think that's pretty impressive, the way that they have managed this to where this is still a very usable weight. In fact, it's lighter than the Sigma 105mm f2.8 macro lens, despite that lens having far less feature set than what this lens does. So those dimensions are 81.4 millimeters or 3.2 inches in diameter and 147.9 millimeters in length, and that is 5.8 inches. So it is a fairly long lens. However, and as mentioned, that's 17 millimeters longer than the 90mm lens. But a big part of that is the fact that they have more depth here to where teleconverters can fit at the back. And that is, I think, in my estimation, that is well worth it. And I would take more lenses that are a little bit longer if they could be used with Sony's teleconverters. And so that weight, 646 grams, that's 22.8 ounces for those of you who speak imperial. Now, to give you a little bit of idea, this lens has the capacity to do 1.4 times or 1 to 4 or 1.4 to 1 level magnification on its own. So that right there gives you some advantage over your typical 1-to-1 macro lens like this Tamron 90mm that I use almost every day. But you put the 1.4 times teleconverter on there, and that focal length changes to 140 millimeters. The magnification goes all the way up to 2 times potentially. And then if you throw on the 2 times teleconverter, the focal length is an effective 200 millimeters, and your magnification is up to 2.8 times potentially. Now, the other advantage there, however, is that maybe you don't need that level of magnification, but what that gives you is the ability to move a little bit further back and have more working room and still get 1-to-1 or higher levels of magnification. And that can make all the difference in the world if you're working for a subject that might get scared off, you know, like living dragonflies or insects, things like that. And so it definitely gives you some extra potential in that regard. Your minimum focus distance is 26 centimeters. And so remember, this is a fairly long lens, and so there's not necessarily a ton of working distance out in front of it, but you throw on those teleconverters, you can move the lens a little bit further back and thus expand that working distance as you go. Another thing that stood out to me is that this lens, if you look at this diagram, has an unusual amount of weather seal points inside. I went through and counted and I saw 19 seal points plus 4 fluorine coating on the front element. So you could argue that there are 20 different seal points as a part of that design. That is definitely a G Master standard. Very, very high level of weather sealing that, you know, the other brand lenses like this Tamron, albeit an excellent lens, but it's not going to match that degree of performance. Again, that's, you know, they're setting the gold master standard, and that is what we are looking for. Now, I was delighted to see in the Sony press briefing the moment that they noticed this, and that is the ability to clutch out of your typical mirrorless autofocus, which is then manual focus, you know, focus by wire. No hard stops, you know, no definite focus positions, but you have this clutch mechanism that drops you down into a true manual focus environment. And that has hard stops. That has permanently defined focus positions. It is so refreshing and so valuable for macro work. There is 170 degrees, that's my estimation of focus throw here. Now, the one limitation is that most of that focus throw is between that 26 centimeter minimum focus distance and about 2 meters. Beyond that 2 meter mark, you've only got about 30 degrees of focus rotation. I did find that a little bit hard when I was manually focusing for my test chart test, because you have to be really precise, because just a tiny bump makes a significant difference in the overall quality of focus there. So this is a lens I would say that outside of macro range, stick with autofocus, because autofocus is awesome. But in macro range, if you're looking for an amazing manual focus experience, this is gorgeous. This is the best way to do things right here, and I really, really love that design. Now, interestingly, they still give you a lot of additional features on the focus by wire side. You have an AF/MF switch, you have a full-time DMF or direct manual focus, and so at any point you can grab that focus ring and turn. But remember, that's focus by wire. It's not going to be as precise, as fantastic as this clutched section down here, but still you're getting very full feature to that. Likewise, you're getting the full G Master approach to aperture. So you have the option of clicks with 1/3 stops. You have the ability then also to declick the aperture, and so to smoothly rack through it, and you can do focus racking, as you can see here, performs that very ably. And you have an iris lock, and so you can either lock into or out of that manual aperture range depending on what your preference is. All good there. Additional features include, other switches are a 3-position focus limiter. I didn't actually use it at all really in my test, other than just to test it, because I found that autofocus is so good I didn't feel like I needed to worry about it. So I was either manual focusing or just letting autofocus do its thing. It's always fast enough. The other thing we've got here is an on and off switch for the OSS, or the optical steady shot, the lens-based stabilization. This is a very effective stabilizer because it is the first that they have ever had that is actually designed, the stabilizing system itself is designed around macro photography. And so it gives you some additional controls of axes, including depth control. And so it's actually reading how far your distance is from your subject, and it is, you know, controlling stabilization based on that. In other words, this is a lens that really is designed in a way that maybe no macro lens has been before, around the idea of doing handheld macro work. And for example, even with the 1.4 times teleconverter attached, and so I was shooting at 140 millimeters, I was able to handhold this macro shot at 1/30th of a second. I just don't know if there's other macro lenses that I would be able to pull that off, at least with any kind of repeatability. And so that is that's very impressive on that front. Likewise, we have a couple of focus hold buttons. And so if you're shooting in, you know, your typical landscape position, you've got one, but if you're shooting in the horizontal position, one will be close to hand there as well. Up front, we've got 67 millimeter front filter threads. We have 11 rounded aperture blades. I don't love wide open geometry. It's a little too pinched in the corners, but if you look at the aperture rack here, as you begin to stop the lens down, it does do a really effective job of keeping a circular aperture shape thanks to those iris blades there. Included here we have a lens hood, and the lens hood itself is actually fairly shallow, and so that kind of it helps to level off the distance length of these two lenses, because while the native lens is longer than the Tamron lens by a fair bit, when you throw on the lens hoods it actually reverses because the Tamron lens hood is so much deeper than the Sony one. But I do like the Sony has that padded front edge, making it a nice stable place to set the lens down like that. It has a lock on it as well, and so you can feel confident in making sure it's not going to come loose on you. So all good. It also comes with a nice zippered padded case as well. The MSRP is, as mentioned, $1,498 US dollars. It'll come for $17.99 Canadian, and so those of you in the Canadian market, that's a really competitive price relative to the US price. It's, by the way, that's $300 more than what the 90mm G macro is. I would say if you're just shopping purely on the Sony platform, looking for first-party Sony lenses, it's pretty easy to justify that extra $300 for this lens with all that it adds. However, there are much cheaper alternatives. The Sigma is a good value, and then a particular good value is this Tamron 90mm, which you can get for around $700, so less than half the price. So, I mean, that's obviously going to be a consideration to think about. These lenses will start to ship in mid-November, according to Sony, so not too long. And so if you want to get a pre-order in, you won't have to wait too long, assuming that all goes well in delivering those things. Altogether, this is a really impressive package. It's a little bit of a busy lens because there's a lot going on here, but it's a lot of good, a lot of valuable control points to making sure this really is a fabulous lens to use for your macro photography. So let's talk autofocus. Out of all the brands that I test, I would say that Sony has done the best job that I have ever seen of putting together a combination of focus motors that allow their lenses to really have the premium autofocus experience. That's definitely true here, as the 100mm GM macro has been equipped with 4 XD linear motors, and those working in concert allow you to have just lightning fast autofocus. It's not unusual for macro lenses to have slower autofocus because there are so many additional focus possibilities, and you can help that by using a focus limiter and eliminating some of those. But in this case, we have so much thrust that it's really not an issue at all. And you can see going from close to distant subjects, it is essentially an instantaneous process. And throughout my whole test period, I felt like in all situations, autofocus just flew. It was always fast, always silent in operation, always very smooth. And so that meant that I could use the lens in a wide variety of situations. You could continue to use it for autofocus, for example, at macro distances, unlike the recent Laowa 180mm F2.8 that I reviewed. You could use it for focus stacking and things like that, and in producing really great end results from that. I found that I could use it for portrait work, and I used it at a wedding, and of course it was lightning fast in those situations. I was able to even nail some shots of the bees going in and out of the hive and able to track that and achieve that. Basically, this is a lens that really doesn't have any kind of limits to its potential because it has such fantastic autofocus. And that's not something that you can say of a lot of macro lenses. So they really have equipped this with what I would say is the G Master standard for autofocus, and that is, in this instance, the very best you can possibly get in 2025. So how about video autofocus? Well, as you probably have seen on all of these outdoor segments, I have been filming with the lens mounted on my new Alpha 1 Mark II, which I will give you a review of somewhere in the near future after I've had enough time with it to give you a good evaluation. However, you can see that it has no problem tracking me in these kind of situations. We'll give it a quick test right now to see how it does if I drop out of frame and I pop back in again and back in, and I suspect you are finding that it has no problem picking me up and tracking me because, as we've already seen, it's got tons of thrust for its autofocus system. Now, when it came to other type tests, I found that for my video pulls, it was really nice and smooth. It actually has a nice level of damping, and so a nice transition without any kind of visible steps, no hunting, no pulsing. none of those things, and of course it is completely silent in operation. When I did my hand test, it really did well overall. There was a couple of times where it didn't want to transition away from my face, but that is largely because of that predictive algorithm that knows that the main focus subject needs to be my face, and so it's trying to continue to track that. But when it did the transitions from my hand to my eye, it was all nice and smooth, and so no concerns about that. You'll find here, if I go backwards a little bit, and then in a moment I'll come back forward, you can see that it has no problem as it tracks me as I get closer into the frame and closer to the camera itself. And so I don't really see any real kind of reservations there. I found that in my clips I got good results. I also found that there is focus breathing, obviously, but most of that focus breathing happens in the macro range. And what I did find is that, like, for example, in my hand test or in that focus pull test, at those more normal distances, focus breathing is, of course, quite well controlled. And yes, you can, in fact, employ the focus breathing compensation if your camera is so equipped. That does come at the cost of a crop factor, but it will eliminate some of that additional focus breathing out of the equation. So at the end of the day, again, this is a really excellent lens, and I will add to that because you have such great manual focus. In this case, you have a true manual focus because of the clutch mechanism that we have talked about. And so what that allows you to do is that in video to really do nicely damped focus pulls with really good precision in macro range, a little less precision and if you're out at this kind of distance. However, if you're in that macro range, manual focus is really fantastic if you're in the clutch true manual focus mode. So at the end of the day, I think autofocus for video is as good as you're going to find on a macro lens. Okay, let's talk optics. This is an optical design of 17 elements in 13 groups. That includes 2 of the Sony specific XA elements, which is extreme aspherical elements, and then also they have 2 of the extra low dispersion elements as well. If you look at the MTF chart is exceptionally good. Over the first half of the frame, it is pretty close to perfect, and then it's only a mild fall off towards the corners. In fact, this is a lens that's sharper in the corners than what many lenses are in the center of the frame. It's a really exceptionally sharp lens. You can see stopping down to f8, it's pretty close to perfect, a little bit of astigmatism, but outside of that, it is really fantastically sharp. And I found that this is a lens that sharpness really showed up. At macro distances, I was really impressed by how much the textures popped. I don't know, with macro lenses, I have high expectations of them optically, and so when I see a little bit of haze on textures with macro lenses, it really turns me off. And I would say that the textures popped from this lens in a way that I just don't remember any other macro lens matching before. It is exceptionally good, and that's even at the high levels of magnification. I found also that when it came to testing for distortion in vignette, there is no distortion, no measurable distortion that I could see, and there is almost no vignette. I used about a plus 22 to correct a little tiny bit in the corners, but you could easily leave those uncorrected and never notice. When I added the 1.4 times teleconverter, it added a little bit of barrel distortion. It was a plus 3 to correct for it, and added a tiny bit more vignette, a plus 29 rather than plus 22. In both cases, that's no big deal. I don't own the 2 times teleconverter, and so I can't test for that, but I would suspect you're just going to see a little bit of exaggeration of both of those qualities, kind of scale that up a bit, and it should give you a sense of what you're going to see with the 2 times teleconverter. I also saw no fringing in any of my tests or in any of my shots, and that's hugely important for macro type work with a lot of shiny surfaces, and so it also allows you to have, allow that to have that really great micro contrast because you're not having any kind of blooming on textures that is robbing you of contrast. And so all of that was perfect. No lateral style chromatic aberrations in the corners as well. All really awesome there. When it came to doing the test, and this is just a quick overview, if you want the deep dive, that's going to be at the end of the video. But I found that it was basically perfect, wide open. Center is perfectly sharp. Mid-frame is exceptionally good. And the corners really look great. I was interesting to see how it compared to the 90mm macro from Tamron because I think that this is actually a really sharp lens. And what I found is basically the GM is kind of like a one step further in terms of performance. The Tamron is good, the GM is great. And that was true all across the frame. It just had that consistent advantage everywhere that I looked. So really impressive on that front. I found that when I stopped the lens down, I really didn't see much of an improvement as I stopped down. So mostly use stopping down for depth of field. I could see a tiny bit maybe in the corners at f8, but I mean, it really isn't much difference to note. Starting at f11, you'll start to see a bit of diffraction. Your minimum aperture is f22, and diffraction will be a little bit more pronounced by that point, particularly on a high-resolution body like the 61-megapixel A7R Mark V that I have done these tests on. There's a few other things that I tested. I did test to see if focus bracketing and then stacking would work with the native lens plus teleconverters. And what I found is that it worked perfectly. I could get shots like this to where this is actually a stack of, in one case 20 and then another case 15 shots. Just allows me to increase that depth of field a bit, but still have the strongly blurred out background, which is really, really useful. And so I was really pleased to see that, because that just adds the ability to automate and thus kind of perfect that technique. And so that's really great. As far as the sharpness, when you add the teleconverter on there, I did notice a bit of a hit to sharpness, but it's still great. It's probably actually pretty comparable to the level that the Tamron is at, even with the teleconverter attached. And so that's really, really great. Again, expect a little bit more of a hit with the 2x teleconverter on there, but still it's going to be a really strong performance. When it comes to the bokeh, I've already mentioned that I don't love the wide open geometry, as you can see here. It's just kind of pinched a little too much in the corners. You stop down to f4 and a lot of that clears up. By f5.6, that is all perfectly clear. But that really was my only complaint when it comes to the quality of the bokeh. At close focus distances, it's really beautiful fall off to where your transition from focus to defocus is really lovely. I found that a little bit further out, you're really strongly blurring out backgrounds. And then a little bit further out still, backgrounds are still, nicely blurred here, and they don't get harsh or busy. And then even at a longer distance, like for full-length portrait work, I found that while it's not obliterating a background like a faster maximum aperture would, what I found is that at f2.8, I had a really nicely, pleasantly defocused background, and the subject stood out really nicely. And so overall, I was really impressed with all of those things. Flare resistance, I would say, is good, but not great. There certainly were instances where I saw some ghosting artifacts, and you can see as I pan back and forth, there's a little bit of a pattern, but what I will say is that it never gets particularly strongly defined and thus harsh, causing any kind of major problem there. Finally, the colors are really beautiful. I mean, this is a lens that is just, it's nailing it optically. And so I think that Sony has done a fantastic job of showing us what a next level macro lens can be capable of. The new Sony FE 100mm f2.8 macro OSS really does set the gold standard for macro lenses. I would say that in every area that I tested, this definitely stands out as being a better product than any macro lens that I've used. I didn't know quite what Sony would do to set itself apart when they did release a G Master macro lens, but I'm really impressed by the choices that they've made, and the fact that while I'm not crazy about the fact that they have excluded other brands from using teleconverters on their platform, I'm at least glad to see them utilize teleconverters. And I've owned the 1.4 times for quite a while, and I primarily have used it in some tests and then in one lens that I own, the 200 to 600 millimeter G lens. So I'm really delighted to see even the potential of more lenses that take advantage of that. And it's one thing if you're going to restrict it from third-party lenses on your platform, but if you produce relatively few lenses that even take advantage of it yourself, you aren't going to sell a lot of teleconverters, truth be told. I see one of the advantages of this new G Master lens is not only is it going to kind of give a permission structure to those who already might own teleconverters to say, hey, here's another lens that takes advantage of something I've already invested in, but also I can see it having the reverse effect that people, some of you who have never owned any of Sony's teleconverters, look at the potential of what it could add to this lens and say, this might be something that I could invest in to dramatically expand my options for this. I think that Sony has also done a great job of checking a lot of boxes that matter to real macro photographers. There's a lot of versatility here for how you get shots, and of course the ability to really do things like focus bracketing and thus focus stacking is going to allow those of you that are truly exceptional macro photographers to get mind-blowingly good macro images. The fact that this lens is so incredibly sharp, even when teleconverters is attached, is extremely, extremely useful. I'm really impressed with this lens, and while I'm very happy with my daily driver macro right now, which is Tamron's 90mm f2.8, this is a lens that I'm going to be personally thinking about long and hard, because I do use macro lenses all the time for my product photography, for showing off, little details for my lens reviews. It's just a lens that I reach for all the time, and this is a lens that I could see additional potential for. And so I think that really Sony has checked the right boxes, and they have delivered a sufficiently superior package that even though it's pricey at $1,500 US, I can see a lot of people saying, it feels like this might be a lens that's worth the money. We'll see if that's true. Now, if you want more information, you've got a couple of options. You can check out my full text review, which is linked in the description down below on the newly resigned DustinAbbott.net. Or if you want a deep dive into the optical performance, well, jump in with me right now and let's take a look together. So let's start by taking a look at vignette and distortion. It may look like I have the same thing side by side, and that's because this lens has no distortion and very, very little vignette. You can see I've corrected a tiny bit of vignette in the corners. No correction for distortion, just a +22 to correct for the vignette. Now, if we add on the 1.4 times teleconverter, you can see that it does create a little bit of barrel distortion. Fortunately, it is nice and linear and not difficult to correct, and there's just a tiny bit more vignette, but not enough to really be statistically significant. Chromatic aberrations are basically perfectly controlled. I don't see anything before or after the plane of focus in this. If we zoom in on the SLR, even to 200% magnification, you can see if we look back at these shiny textures, there's nothing to see there. It's just perfectly controlled. No issues at all with that. Neither is there any kind of fringing around specular highlights. Likewise with the lateral style chromatic aberrations, all clear here at the corner of the frame. No problem at all with that. So let's take a look at our sharpness and contrast. In the center of the frame, you can see even at 200% magnification, it looks fantastic. Mid-frame is looking excellent. Down all the way into the corners, it looks excellent all the way there. Likewise, we have nice consistency looking at both sides of the frame and all four corners. Everywhere, it just looks awesome. So for a quick point of reference, here's what the Tamron here on the right looks like. You can see if you look at the sails, for example, there's just not the same level of detail there in the Tamron. The Tamron looks good, but it is just not as perfectly crisp as what the Sony lens is. We have different chart on there, but take a look here. This mid-frame zone, you can see it's just, this looks a little bit muddy on the Tamron by comparison. Perfectly crisp there on the Sony result. Likewise down here, same kind of thing. Everywhere that we look, the Tamron is good, but the Sony is great. Now, likewise, if we throw the 1.4 times teleconverter, which is the only one I have, it's the only one I can test, you can see that the focal length changes to 140 millimeters. The maximum aperture is f4 now because it does lose a stop of light. Likewise, the 2 times, you're going to drop down to a maximum aperture of f5.6. So if we compare these two lenses, we can see that really this is every bit as good, if not a bit more than what the Tamron was, just with the bare lens. And so that's really impressive there. We can see it's still looking good in the mid frame. It's dropping a little bit, and likewise into the corners. You can see that the corners are a little bit softer, but overall it's still holding up really quite remarkably well. Now, what I found when I began to stop the lens down is that, frankly, there's not really a whole lot of improvement here. And so here from f2.8 to f4, and if we go from f4 all the way down to f8, I do think f8 is a little bit better in the corners, but really you're not getting much more than what you got at f2.8. At f11, you'll start to see some effect of diffraction, though you can see this is still a very, very usable result, so don't hesitate to use f11. f22, however, the minimum aperture I say is a different story. You can see just how much softer it is due to the effects of diffraction. Now here you can see the highest level of magnification with the bare lens. This is 1.4 times. If we pop in there and take a look at this, you can see the weave of the paper. Like, it's really, really great. Even with the 1.4 times on there, you can see the magnification level is jumping up to 2 times magnification. That is a very noticeable difference, and it'll be even more noticeable going from that to f2.8 with the 2 times on there. And we can see still, again, while it's not as perfectly crisp, in the area here you can see it's looking really, really sharp. As noted before, you can get really good handheld macro results. This shot here, this is a handheld macro shot with the 1.4 times on there, and you can see it's looking really, really fantastic. Here's another, and that is, once again, that's a handheld macro with the 1.4 times teleconverter on there. So pretty impressive in the results you can get with it. Now, I've talked about the geometry that I don't love wide open, but here this is at f8, and so a lot of times at macro distances, you're going to want to stop down anyway because depth of field is just so small. And one thing I notice is, number one, I mean, it's great macro performance, but here as we watch the going towards defocus, we can see that it's holding up nicely in terms of the geometry towards the edges there. Likewise here, it's nice and round, and so for macro type work, I think it's going to do a beautiful job. Here's another macro type shot, and here you can see a transition from before to after in terms of the just defocus, but then also look at, there's just no longitudinal style chromatic aberration. Really, really great transition there. Likewise here, I'm really impressed by just how much detail is rendered there, and that really kind of stands out to me. That's a lot of fun to play with right there. So great stuff there. You can see that standard defocus towards the background. The background here is nicely blurred out. I like that a lot. Here for portrait type work, you've got nice dimensionality of the subjects. You can see that they're standing out really nicely. Great detail and texture on them. But as we look past them towards the area that's defocused, you can still, I mean, if you step back, you can still see everything that's there, but it's nicely defocused. There's no harsh edges, nothing grabbing the eye. Here's another where we can see looking towards the distant background. Everything just has a nice transition to defocus, and you can see that the detail on the ladies here looks really fantastic. Here's another handheld macro shot that just shows off all the good stuff. Here, great detail, great contrast, very steady shot, and then as you transition to defocus, it just looks fantastic. So I wanted to experiment here with a bit of the focus bracketing and to see how that worked out with this lens, both of the bare lens, so starting here. So what I've done is I've just done enough frames to where you can see all of the graphites are in focus. And so that just makes a real difference here. I wanted that very shallow depth of field to be maintained, which you can see it has. But now we've just got all of this in focus, which makes for a more compelling image. And of course, I could do all of that automating within the camera to where the camera was making the focus adjustments. So I wanted to know if you could do the same thing with the teleconverters on there. Can the camera still do all of that bracketing without problems? Well, the answer is yes. And so you can see here that rather than just having one of the screw heads in focus, now I have enough depth of field to where I've got the front two in focus and all of that really, really crispy detail showing up there. And then to start that transition towards defocus. And as you look towards the area where the images are defocused, they look the exact same. And so that's a really useful thing once again. And that was done, that's 15 frames taken with the teleconverter attached with the camera doing all of the bracketing. Super useful for macro work. Now, if you're just looking at still images for the flare resistance, you can see there's a little bit going on there wide open. If I stop down, there's a little bit more of a ghosting pattern. You can see a bit more here. It's really going to be composition specific. But as you saw when we pan back and forth across the sun, there's just more noticeable flare at different points. So I guess word to the wise is just be careful with your composition and you'll probably be just fine. So thanks for sticking around until the very end. I hope that deep dive into the optics helps to give you the information that you were looking for. As always, thanks for watching. Have a great day and let the light in.